Chapter 1: The First Glimpse. The town of Hollow Creek lay in eerie silence, its streets blanketed in an unnatural mist. Ethan Carter, a journalist with a knack for uncovering mysteries, walked cautiously through the deserted town square, his camera hanging from his neck. The buildings, old and decayed, seemed to watch him with unseen eyes, their shattered windows dark and soulless. Something about this place felt wrong. As he wandered past a long-abandoned general store, a glint of movement caught his eye in the cracked display window. He stopped in his tracks. A shadow, faint yet unmistakable, flickered within the reflection. A man, tall, unmoving, stood behind him in the glass. A chill gripped Ethan's spine as he spun around, expecting to see someone there. But there was no one, just the empty streets stretching into the fog, as silent and lifeless as before. His heart pounded. He turned back to the window and his breath hitched. The shadow was still there, still watching. He lifted his camera, snapping a photo. The flash cut through the mist, revealing nothing but the empty storefront. He lowered his camera slowly. The shadow had vanished. His mind raced for an explanation. A trick of the light, his own reflection distorted. But something about that figure, the way it stood, the way it seemed separate from the world, unnerved him. The town felt heavier now, as if it had woken up and noticed him for the first time. The whispering wind carried an unsettling thought to the back of his mind. He was not alone, and whoever was here, whoever had been in the glass, was waiting for him to see them again. Chapter 2: The Empty Reflection. Ethan wiped condensation from the mirror of the abandoned motel bathroom, staring at his tired face. The dim, flickering light above cast jagged shadows across his features, but something about his reflection unsettled him. He reached up to run a hand through his hair. His reflection did not. A cold wave of fear rushed through him. He froze, watching as his mirrored self caught up, moving an instant too late. The lag was subtle at first, but as he leaned closer it worsened. When he tilted his head to the left, his reflection hesitated, then jerked to mimic him. His breath grew shallow. This wasn't a trick of bad lighting or fatigue. Something was wrong. His fingers twitched and his reflections did not. His pulse hammered in his ears as he took a step back, but his mirrored image remained perfectly still, staring with hollow, unblinking eyes. He turned away, gripping the edges of the sink, forcing himself to breathe. When he looked back up, his reflection was gone. The mirror was empty. A deep, suffocating silence filled the room. He felt the weight of something behind him, something watching. His throat tightened as he slowly turned around, expecting to see someone, something standing there. But the room was empty. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He forced himself to move, stepping away from the mirror, avoiding his own gaze. The moment his back was turned, he swore he heard it. His own reflection, whispering in a voice just barely his own. "You don't belong here." Chapter 3: A Name That Shouldn't Exist. Ethan sat at a heavy wooden desk in the Hollow Creek Town archives, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust. Dim light from an oil lamp flickered across the faded record stacked before him. The town's history was a mystery wrapped in silence, and he was determined to untangle it. His fingers traced the brittle pages of an old census book, yellowed with age. As he flipped through the records, noting names that had long faded from memory, his breath caught. There, in neat cursive script, was a name that should not exist. Ethan Carter. He stared at the name, his heart pounding. The ink was old, smudged slightly in places, yet clear enough to read. The date next to it chilled him to the core. 1893. His mind raced. How could this be? His own name recorded over a century ago. A relative? A coincidence? He turned the page, looking for more, but the entry ended abruptly. No birth record, no family information, just a name, scrawled in a list of long-forgotten souls. As he traced his fingers over the name, the edges of the book seemed to blur. His vision swam and a strange sensation crawled over his skin, as if the room had suddenly shifted. He could hear the faintest echo of whispers, layered upon each other, speaking in hushed urgency. The lamp flickered. The room felt colder. A sudden gust of air ruffled the pages, though there were no windows open. The book trembled slightly under his touch, as though resisting him. He turned back to the page with his name, and his blood ran cold. The ink had changed. The name Ethan Carter was no longer written in faded black ink. It was fresh, wet, as if it had just been written. And beneath it, in a hurried, scrawled hand, were 3 words. "You have returned." Ethan stumbled backward, knocking over the chair. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him in every corner of the room. The walls of the archive seemed to pulse, breathing in rhythm with his own racing heartbeat. Shaking, he grabbed his camera and snapped a photo of the page, but when he looked at the screen, the image showed only a blank sheet. No name, no warning, nothing at all. A deep, unnatural silence filled the room. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the whispers stopped. He wasn't just uncovering the town's past. The town was uncovering him. Chapter 4. Shadows Without a Source. Ethan sat in the dimly lit motel room, flipping through the photographs he had taken earlier in the day. Each one seemed normal at first glance, but as he examined them closely, he noticed something strange. Shadows where there shouldn't have been any. In several photos, elongated figures stretched across walls and streets, though there was no one visible to cast them. A chill ran down his spine. He tossed the photos aside and leaned back, exhaling sharply. The town was getting to him. The stillness, the eerie echoes of past lives. It was all seeping into his mind. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake the unease gnawing at him. Then, movement. A shadow flickered in his peripheral vision. He turned sharply, eyes scanning the room. Nothing. His pulse quickened as he glanced at the floor near the lamp. His own shadow stretched naturally, cast by the dim light. But another shadow, one that did not belong, lingered near the door. It was motionless, silent. His breath caught in his throat. His fingers gripped the edge of the chair. The shadow wasn't attached to anything. There was no figure to cast it, just a dark, elongated shape stretching unnaturally toward him. A sudden knock at the door made him jump. The shadow vanished. Heart hammering, Ethan stood and approached the door. He hesitated before placing his hand on the knob. "Who's there?" he called, his voice hoarse. No response. He slowly cracked the door open. The hallway was empty, silent except for the faint rustling of wind through the broken windows down the corridor. His eyes darted back and forth, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Shaking his head, he shut the door and locked it. Turning back toward the room, his stomach twisted into a knot. The shadows were back. This time they moved. Chapter 5. The Vanishing Footsteps. Ethan walked cautiously down the empty streets of Hollow Creek, the mist thickening around him like a living entity. The eerie silence of the town had become familiar, but tonight something was different. Every few steps, a distinct crunch of gravel echoed behind him. He stopped abruptly, holding his breath. The footsteps ceased just as suddenly. A shiver crept up his spine. He turned around, his eyes scanning the dimly lit street, but there was nothing. Only the empty road stretching into the darkness. He exhaled shakily and continued walking. Crunch, crunch. Again, footsteps followed. He spun around, faster this time, his heart pounding against his ribs. Still nothing. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe. Maybe it was the echo of his own steps bouncing off the abandoned buildings. Maybe it was the way the town played tricks on the mind. But deep down, he knew better. He reached for his camera, snapping a photo of the street behind him. The flash illuminated the area for a split second. He checked the display. Empty. No sign of movement. But as he lowered the camera, the sound returned, this time running. Rapid, heavy steps closing in. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he turned on his heel, ready to face whatever was behind him. Nothing. The street was silent once more, the mist undisturbed. Yet, the sensation of being watched wrapped around him, suffocating. His pulse thundered as he glanced down. His footprints were clear in the dust-covered road, but right beside them, another set, and they were still forming one by one, moving closer. Ethan stumbled back, his foot catching the edge of the curb. His hand fumbled for his flashlight, but before he could turn it on, the air shifted, the temperature plummeted. The whispers returned. "Don't look back." His breath hitched. The voice was barely audible, blending into the wind. He forced himself forward, walking faster, ignoring the growing sense of dread clawing at his chest. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The footsteps matched his pace perfectly, no longer behind him, but beside him. He ran. He didn't know where, didn't care. The town blurred as he sprinted, his legs burning, his heartbeat deafening. He darted through an alley, kicking up dust, rounding a corner so fast he nearly lost his footing. And then, silence. He stopped, gasping for air, his vision swimming. Slowly, cautiously, he turned back to the road behind him. The footprints were gone. The dust, once disturbed, had settled as if he had never been there. The street, eerily undisturbed, stretched before him, empty as before. And yet, the feeling lingered. Something had been there, something had followed him, and it was still waiting. Chapter 6. The Forgotten Room. Ethan walked cautiously through the abandoned manor at the edge of Hollow Creek, his flashlight flickering against the crumbling walls. Dust particles swirled in the stagnant air, undisturbed for years. The house had stood empty for decades, yet something about it felt inhabited, alive with an unseen presence. As he moved deeper into the hall, his footfalls echoed unnaturally, the silence oppressive. He paused when he noticed something strange. A door, weathered and warped with age, stood at the end of the hallway. Ethan was certain it hadn't been there before. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing against him. Slowly, he reached out and turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. A chill settled over his skin as he stepped inside. The walls were lined with old portraits, their cracked frames holding paintings of unfamiliar faces. Except one. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Hanging at the center of the wall was a portrait of him. He stepped closer, heart hammering. The painting was old, the edges of the canvas frayed, but the likeness was unmistakable. His own face staring back at him. The expression was eerily neutral, the eyes hollow yet knowing. His fingers trembled as he reached out to touch it, but the moment his fingertips brushed the canvas, a whisper filled the room. "Welcome back." Ethan recoiled, his pulse spiking. He spun around, scanning the empty room. No one was there, just the portraits, watching. The door behind him slammed shut. The whispers swirled, voices overlapping, growing louder. Ethan backed away from the painting, but his reflection in its glass didn't move. Instead, it smiled. His own voice, distorted, inhuman, whispered back, "You should not have come." Chapter 7. The Stranger in the Photographs. Ethan sat in his dimly lit motel room, the air thick with unease, as he carefully developed the photos he had taken earlier that day. The images slowly emerged on the paper, revealing the deserted streets of Hollow Creek, the decayed buildings, and the thick fog clinging to the town. At first glance, they were exactly as he had expected, but as he flipped through the pictures, his blood ran cold. A figure, tall, shadowed, and indistinct, stood in the background of every single frame. Ethan's fingers trembled as he examined the images more closely. The figure was never in the same spot twice, always shifting, always watching. In some photos, it was standing in the middle of the road. In others, it lurked at the edge of a building, half hidden in the mist. But its shape remained eerily consistent, unnaturally elongated, like a shadow cast by something that wasn't there. His stomach twisted as he pulled out the first picture he had taken, the reflection in the cracked store window. There, behind him, was the same tall figure, barely distinguishable but unmistakably present. Ethan swallowed hard. He had seen nothing when he took the pictures. No movement, no presence. He had been alone, or so he thought. His breath quickened. He reached for his camera, gripping it tightly, as if searching for some tangible explanation. But as he turned his attention back to the photographs, a terrible realization settled over him like a weight. The last image, the final shot he had taken before returning to the motel. The figure was closer. No longer distant, no longer a vague shape in the fog. It was standing directly behind him. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He dropped the photo as a sudden chill filled the room, the air turning heavy, suffocating. The dim light flickered above him, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. The feeling of being watched was no longer a mere suspicion. It was an undeniable certainty. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned toward the mirror on the far wall, dreading what he might see. At first, there was nothing, just his own pale, shaken reflection staring back at him. But then, movement. A shift in the darkness behind him, and a voice, low, almost imperceptible, whispered in his ear, "You took too many pictures." Chapter 8. Voices from the silent hallway. Ethan lay awake in his motel room, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the relentless ticking of the clock on the wall. Sleep had become an impossible task ever since he arrived in Hollow Creek. The eerie silence of the town weighed on him, a heavy presence that never seemed to lift. Then, just as his eyelids grew heavy, he heard it, a whisper. His name. It was faint, like wind slipping through an open crack, but unmistakable. "Ethan!" He sat up instantly, heart pounding against his ribs. The room was empty, the door locked, the windows shut. He swallowed hard, telling himself it was his imagination, a byproduct of exhaustion. But then he heard it again. Closer this time. Then a chill settled over his skin as he swung his legs off the bed, slowly standing. The whisper hadn't come from inside the room. It came from outside, beyond the thin motel door, drifting in from the hallway. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to stay put, but the journalist in him overpowered his fear. With slow, cautious steps, he moved toward the door and pressed his ear against the wood. Silence. Then, a rustling sound, a shuffle, like someone shifting their weight just outside his room. Holding his breath, he reached for the doorknob and twisted it open just a crack. The dim hallway stretched out before him, illuminated only by the flickering overhead light. The doors to the other rooms stood closed, and the wallpaper peeled in, or so he thought. A shadow flickered at the far end of the hall, vanishing around the corner. His stomach twisted. He couldn't tell if it had been human or something else entirely. Then, directly behind him, in a voice barely more than a breath, "Ethan, we see you?" He spun around, heart in his throat, but the room was just as he had left it. Empty. The silence stretched, suffocating, as the motel light flickered again. For the first time since he arrived in Hollow Creek, he realized something terrifying. He was being hunted. Chapter 9. The Mirror That Lied. Ethan stood frozen before the cracked motel mirror, his breath hitching as a chill ran down his spine. He had barely noticed at first, but now he couldn't ignore it. His reflection wasn't right. The movements were off, a fraction of a second ahead of his own, anticipating each action as though it knew what he would do before he did. He lifted his hand slowly, flexing his fingers. The mirror Ethan mirrored the gesture, but just as his fingers curled into a fist, the reflection hesitated, then grinned. Ethan's stomach twisted. He wasn't smiling. A deep, creeping dread spread through his chest. His pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't a mere trick of the light or exhaustion. It was something else. Something watching. Something pretending to be him. He stepped back, his heart racing. The reflection did not. It stood in place, its grin widening, stretching just slightly too far. The corners of its mouth pulled back unnaturally, revealing teeth too sharp, too perfect. Ethan's breath turned ragged. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to think rationally, to break whatever illusion was taking hold of him. Then the reflection took a step forward. Not in the glass, but out of it. A faint crack splintered along the mirror's surface, an unnatural warping distorting Ethan's features. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. His chest tightened, an overwhelming sense of wrongness pressing against him. His muscles locked, every fiber of his being screaming at him to move, to run. But he couldn't. The mirror Ethan tilted its head, its eyes darkening, its expression unreadable. Then, in a voice just like his own, it whispered, "You don't belong here, but I do." The light in the room flickered violently. A deafening shatter erupted as the mirror exploded outward, shards of glass flying in every direction. Ethan stumbled backward, shielding his face, feeling the sting of cuts along his arms. When he looked up, the reflection was gone. But the grin still lingered, hanging in the air like an echo of something that was no longer bound to the glass. Something that was now free. Chapter 10. When the World Looked Away. Ethan stepped outside, inhaling deeply, trying to shake off the unease that had wrapped itself around him. The air in Hollow Creek had always felt heavy, but now, something was different. The silence pressed in on him, denser than before, as if the world itself had taken a breath and refused to let it out. He turned toward the road leading out of town, expecting to see the familiar stretch of cracked pavement vanishing into the fog. But there was nothing at all. His pulse quickened. The road, the trees, the distant horizon, all gone. In their place, an endless void stretched out in every direction. No sky, no stars, no world beyond Hollow Creek. He took a hesitant step forward, but the moment his foot crossed the town's edge, an overwhelming force pressed against him, pushing him back. His breath hitched. He turned sharply, scanning the town behind him. The buildings still stood, the eerie quiet still hung in the air, but something about it all felt staged, as if the town itself had become a set. A hollow stage built for a play where he was the only actor. He reached for his phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. No signal, no Wi-Fi. The time on the screen flickered erratically before freezing completely. His throat tightened as realization sank in. He was trapped. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure stood at the far end of the street, watching, tall, still, featureless in the haze. The moment he blinked, it was gone. Ethan stumbled backward, his breath uneven. He needed to get out. He needed to wake up from whatever nightmare this had become. But there was no waking up, no escaping, because beyond Hollow Creek, the world had simply stopped existing. Chapter 11. The Door That Opened by Itself. The old motel had long since been abandoned, yet its doors still held their secrets. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the single wooden door across the room. It had remained locked since his arrival, its keyhole rusted over, its handle stiff with age. He had checked it a dozen times, convinced it led to nothing more than an empty supply closet. But at exactly midnight, without warning, the lock clicked open with a dull snap. His breath caught in his throat. He hadn't moved. No one else was in the room, and yet the door creaked forward, revealing a dark, descending staircase where none should exist. A heavy stillness pressed against the walls. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears as he approached the entrance. The air beyond the threshold was cold, unnaturally so. A chill slithered along his skin, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and something faintly metallic, like old blood. His flashlight flickered as he aimed it downward. The stairs were steep, stretching into a darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the light whole. He swallowed hard. This was impossible. There had been no record of a basement in the building plans, no mention of underground tunnels. Yet here it was, an invitation into the unknown. Something shifted in the blackness below. A whisper curled up the stairwell, soft and broken, like wind through shattered glass. "Come." Ethan's blood ran cold. The voice was wrong, distorted, as if spoken through layers of water. He took a shaky step back, gripping the edge of the doorframe. Every instinct screamed at him to shut the door, to run, but his journalist's curiosity held him frozen in place, waiting. The whisper came again, closer, and then, from deep within the abyss, a single pale hand reached out, pressing against the bottom step. The door slammed shut on its own, the lock clicking back into place. Ethan staggered away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The air in the room was heavy, charged with something unseen. He reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The stairwell was gone. No trace of it remained. Only the cold lingered, wrapping around him like unseen fingers. Whatever had been down there, whatever had been waiting, was still listening. Chapter 12. The notebook with blank pages. Ethan's heart sank the moment he reached for his journal and found it missing. He tore through his belongings, rifling through his bag, the sheets of his bed, the dusty corners of the motel room. It had been there last night, he was sure of it. He had written in it before trying and failing to sleep. The whispers had kept him awake. With a deep breath, he tried to calm himself. Maybe he had left it somewhere else, absent-mindedly placed it on the nightstand or the old desk in the corner. But as he checked each space, dread settled over him like a thick fog. It was nowhere to be found. Frustration simmered beneath his fear. That notebook contained everything. His notes, his theories, the strange occurrences that plagued Hollow Creek. If someone had taken it, they had stolen more than just paper. They had taken evidence. Then, just as suddenly as it had vanished, it was back, sitting neatly in the middle of the desk, as if it had never been gone. Ethan's blood ran cold. He had just searched that spot. His breath shallow, he reached out, his fingers hesitant as they brushed against the worn leather cover. It was colder than it should have been, as if it had been sitting outside in the night air. Slowly, he opened it. His hands began to shake. Every word he had written was gone. The pages, once filled with frantic notes and sketches, were now blank. But they weren't empty. New words had appeared, scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting, ink still drying. It wasn't his story anymore. It was someone else's. The words bled together, shifting as if they were alive, rearranging themselves into sentences that whispered directly into his mind. It told of another journalist, another man who had come to Hollow Creek searching for the truth. A man who had vanished. The final line sent a chill through his bones. He was erased. Chapter 13. The Man in the Darkness. Ethan's breath hitched as he stood frozen on the deserted street of Hollow Creek. The fog was thicker tonight, swirling unnaturally, wrapping around the buildings like ghostly fingers. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he focused on the figure standing ahead of him. It was a man, identical to himself, his exact height, his same worn-out jacket, the same strands of unkempt hair brushing against his forehead. But something was wrong. The figure did not move. It did not shift or breathe. It simply stood there, eyes locked onto Ethan's, though no expression graced its face. Ethan's fingers tightened around the camera hanging from his neck. Slowly he raised it, the lens shaking in his grip as he peered through the viewfinder. The figure was still there, unmoving, waiting. He pressed the shutter. The flash cut through the fog. The figure vanished. Ethan gasped, spinning around wildly. The street was empty once more, save for the endless mist. His pulse pounded in his throat. Had he imagined it? Was the town finally getting to him? He glanced at his camera's preview screen. The photo showed the empty street, void of any figure, but as he squinted, his stomach twisted into knots. There, at the very edge of the frame, barely distinguishable through the haze, was a shadowy outline. A reflection of himself where there should be none. A whisper curled through the mist, soft, eerie, chilling him to his core. I have been waiting. Chapter 14. Fading from reality. Ethan stared at his feet, expecting to see his own shadow stretching across the dimly lit floor, but there was nothing. A void where his outline should have been. Panic surged in his chest as he turned, searching for any sign of himself reflected in the broken glass of a nearby window. Nothing. The world recognized his presence less and less with each passing moment. His pulse hammered. He whispered to himself, calling his own name, but his voice did not echo back. It was as though the air swallowed the sound before it could travel. His fingers trembled as he reached out to grasp the chair beside him. But as his hand made contact, there was no resistance. His fingers passed through the wood as if it were nothing but mist. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. He tried again, this time gripping the edge of the desk in front of him. His hand sank through it like it wasn't there. He felt nothing. The weight of his own body felt lighter, as though he wasn't fully tethered to the ground anymore. This wasn't just an illusion. He was unraveling, fading from the world piece by piece. A sickening realization crept into his mind. Hollow Creek wasn't just a haunted town. It was a place that consumed those who searched too long, who asked too many questions. It was erasing him, rewriting him into something unseen. His heartbeat faltered as the whispers surrounded him again, curling around him like a suffocating fog. He was running out of time. Chapter 15. The Final Whisper. Ethan felt his body lighten, his form becoming less distinct. The town of Hollow Creek had consumed him, rewriting his existence like it had done to countless others before him. His voice no longer echoed, his reflection was gone, and even the ground beneath his feet felt distant, as if he were no longer fully part of the world. He tried to speak, but no sound came. His thoughts, his memories, everything that made him who he was began to slip away. The wind carried his name, whispering it like a forgotten tale. Ethan Carter. He had been real once, hadn't he? The buildings around him seemed to pulse, shifting as if reality itself was adjusting to his absence. The camera that once hung from his neck clattered to the ground, the last tangible evidence of his presence. But even that, in moments, would be wiped away. The town remained still, awaiting its next visitor, the next story to be rewritten. And as the mist thickened and the whispers grew fainter, Ethan Carter ceased to be. Hollow Creek had taken another,